It's hard to believe at the age of 22 that Ethan was a fixer. Ethan Cross had cleaned up a lot of messes in his career. Insider trading, high-profile affairs, even the occasional accidental overdose. But when he got the call about Nathaniel Langston, he knew this one was going to be different. Because this wasn't just any rich kid screwing up. This was the CEO's son. And he hadn't just crashed a car. He had ruined a life. Drunk driving. Female victim. Critical condition. The voice on the other end of the phone had said, his father wants it handled. Quietly. Ethan had sighed, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. Of course he does. By the time he arrived at the private estate when Nathaniel was being kept under wraps, the media was already circling like sharks. The Langston family had money, power, and influence, but even they couldn't make a story like this disappear without a trace. Ethan stepped inside the house, adjusting his cufflinks as he took in the scene. The air smelled of expensive cologne and barely concealed panic. Nathaniel was sitting on the edge of the couch, his hands threaded through his messy blonde hair. He looked less like a trust fund brat and more like a man waiting for his own execution. His father, Richard Langston, stood behind him, his face carved from stone. "You're late," Richard said coldly. Ethan gave a practiced, polite smile. "Damage control takes time. I assume you want to keep this out of the headlines." "I want it gone." Ethan's eyes flicked back to Nathaniel, who hadn't said a word. His knuckles were white from how tightly he gripped his own hands. His face was pale, eyes red-rimmed like he hadn't slept or had been crying. "Interesting. I need to hear from him," Ethan said, nodding toward Nathaniel. Richard frowned. "That's not necessary." "We." "It is if you want me to fix this properly." Ethan cut in, his tone smooth but firm. "Nathaniel." For the first time, the young man looked up, his blue eyes locking onto Ethan's. And Ethan felt something strange twist in his chest. Guilt. Raw, suffocating guilt. Not from himself, but from Nathaniel. And that was the moment Ethan knew. This wasn't just another cover-up. This was a man who was already drowning. And for some reason, Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to throw him a lifeline. The golden boy with a tarnished soul. Nathaniel Langston had the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers. Sharp cheekbones, perfectly tousled blonde hair, piercing blue eyes. The golden boy of the Langston Empire. But right now he looked like hell. Ethan had handled his fair share of rich, reckless men who thought money could erase consequences. They always came in two types. Those who fought tooth and nail to dodge responsibility, and those who collapsed under the weight of their own self-destruction. Nathaniel was the second kind. He hadn't spoken since Ethan arrived. He just sat there, shoulders hunched, his fingers twisting together like he could physically wring the guilt from his own body. "Tell me what happened," Ethan said, his voice measured, professional. Nathaniel swallowed hard. His father made a noise of protest, but Ethan silenced him with a sharp glance. Nathaniel exhaled shakily, his gaze dropping to the floor. He cleared his throat, voice hoarse like he hadn't spoken in hours. "I was at a club, drinking. Too much. My friends left, but he rubbed a hand over his face. I thought I was fine to drive." Ethan didn't react. He'd heard this story 100 times. "I wasn't," Nathaniel whispered. "I ran a red light. She was in the crosswalk. I didn't even see her until it was too late." A pause, then a sharp inhale, like he was choking on his own confession. "I got out. I saw her." He squeezed his eyes shut. "She was just lying there, and I panicked. I just stood there like a goddamn coward until someone called 911. His voice cracked. "She has 2 kids. Ethan studied him carefully. This wasn't rehearsed. This wasn't performance of a privileged man trying to manipulate the situation. This was real, raw. It made things harder. Because Ethan knew how to handle soulless men. But guilt-ridden ones? The ones who actually felt the consequences of their actions? Those were dangerous. Because they made his job a hell of a lot messier. The woman, Samantha Reyes, Ethan said, keeping his voice even. She survived, but she's paralyzed from the waist down." Nathaniel flinched like he'd been struck. His hands curled into fists. "Her family will be compensated. Richard Langston interjected, his voice sharp, controlled. A generous settlement, enough to keep them comfortable for life. We need to ensure this doesn't become a legal battle. Nathaniel's head snapped up. A settlement? His voice wavered between disbelief and disgust. You think writing a check is going to fix this? Ethan met his gaze, his own expression unreadable. It's how these things are handled, Nathaniel. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. And if I don't want it handled? Silence. Richard turned to his son, his tone cold as steel. You don't have a choice. Nathaniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Of course I don't. He looked back at Ethan, eyes searching, desperate. Is this just normal for you? Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second. Yes, he said simply. Nathaniel's lips parted, like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he just exhaled, his body sinking further into the couch. Ethan should have felt relieved, should have seen this as another victory, another scandal contained. But all he felt was something dangerously close to regret, a deal with the devil. Ethan wasn't sure why he lingered. The deal was simple. The Langstons would pay off Samantha Reyes' family. The best lawyers in the country would make the case disappear, and Nathaniel would walk away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. It was the kind of job Ethan could do in his sleep, the kind of job he had done time and time again. But as he stood in the dimly lit study of the Langston estate, watching Nathaniel swirl a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, something felt off. You're supposed to be relieved, Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. Nathaniel let out a breathy laugh, but there was no humor in it. Relieved? He turned his head, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Ethan's. A woman is paralyzed because of me. Her kids don't have a mother who can chase after them in the yard or pick them up when they fall. And my father wants to throw money at it and pretend it never happened. His fingers tightened around the glass. I don't want this to go away. Ethan studied him carefully. So, what do you want? Nathaniel set the whiskey down, untouched, to feel something other than disgust when I look in the mirror. It was a dangerous answer. Ethan should have shut it down, told him that guilt wasn't useful, that emotions didn't belong in situations like this. But instead, he said, Then why are you letting your father make this choice for you? Nathaniel's breath hitched and Ethan saw it. The flicker of rebellion behind his tortured gaze. It was buried under layers of privilege and expectation, but it was there. The part of him that wanted to face the consequences, even if it destroyed him. Before Ethan could stop himself, he stepped closer, close enough to smell the faint traces of cologne and whiskey on Nathaniel's skin. You're used to people telling you what to do, Ethan murmured. Your father, your lawyers, me. He tilted his head slightly. But you're not a child. If you really want to take responsibility, no one is stopping you. Nathaniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed. You're supposed to be convincing me to stay quiet. Ethan smirked faintly. I'm supposed to be doing a lot of things. Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken, something neither of them were ready to name. Nathaniel was the first to break it. And what happens if I do confess? Ethan exhaled, stepping back, retreating into his usual professionalism. Prison time. Not much. Your family can still control the narrative, but enough to make a statement. He folded his arms. And you'd be throwing your entire life away. Nathaniel nodded slowly, like he already knew that. Like he had known it since the moment he saw Samantha Reyes lying broken in the street. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. Would you visit me? Ethan's breath caught. Just for a second. Just long enough for Nathaniel to notice. He should have lied. Should have told him this wasn't personal. But instead, he said, Yeah, Nathaniel, I would. And that was the moment Ethan realized he was in deeper than he ever should have been. Lines that shouldn't be crossed. Ethan prided himself on control. His entire career had been built on it. Controlling situations, controlling people, controlling himself. But Nathaniel Langston was a problem. The smart move would be to walk away, let the Langston legal team handle fallout, while he moved on to the next crisis. But that wasn't happening. Because instead of keeping his distance, he was sitting across from Nathaniel at a private booth in a low-lit bar, watching him nurse a bourbon he barely touched. This isn't exactly laying low, Ethan murmured, glancing around. Nathaniel smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. No one in here cares who I am. He leaned back, looking Ethan over. Besides, I needed a break from my father breathing down my neck. Ethan arched a brow. And you called me because... Nathaniel swirled his drink, watching the ice shift. Because I feel like you're the only one who actually sees me. Ethan's stomach tightened. Dangerous. That was the only word for this. He should have shut it down right there. Instead, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. And what is it you think I see? Nathaniel exhaled, his blue eyes locking onto Ethan's with a raw, unguarded intensity. That I don't want to be saved. Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing his expression to remain neutral. He had dealt with broken men before, had watched them spiral, had cleaned up their messes, but this was different. Nathaniel wasn't just some reckless playboy trying to dodge consequences. He was a man on the verge of self-destruction, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't know if he wanted to stop him. You're used to being told what to do, Ethan said, echoing their conversation from before. So, let me ask you again, Nathaniel. What do you want? Nathaniel's lips parted slightly, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should. Then, without warning, he slid out of the booth, standing up, Ethan's brows furrowed. Where are you? Nathaniel reached out, fingers brushing against Ethan's wrist. Come with me? Ethan hesitated. He knew exactly where this was going, knew the kind of lines they were about to cross. And yet, he found himself standing, following, because for the first time in years, control didn't feel like the most important thing in the world. The hotel room was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Outside, the city hummed with life, but inside it was just them, Ethan and Nate, standing at the precipice of something that neither of them had expected but neither could deny. Nate was the first to move. He reached for Ethan with a slow, deliberate touch, fingers trailing down the crisp fabric of his dress shirt. There was hesitation in his eyes, not out of uncertainty but reverence, like he was afraid to break something sacred. You don't have to do this, Ethan murmured, even as his own body betrayed him, leaning into Nate's warmth. I want to, Nate whispered back, voice rough with emotion. For the first time in weeks, I don't feel like I'm drowning when I'm with you. Ethan exhaled sharply, his resolve unraveling. He cupped Nate's face, his thumb brushing over the faint stubble on his jaw. It wasn't just desire between them. It was something deeper, something fragile, something that neither of them could afford but both desperately needed. When their lips met, it was slow and searching. There was no rush, no hunger for dominance, just an unspoken promise. Ethan tasted whiskey and regret on Nate's lips, but beneath it, something sweeter, something real. They moved toward the bed, their bodies drawn together like opposing magnets. Ethan let Nate take the lead, let him explore, let him feel in control of something. Anything, when his world had spiraled so far beyond his grasp. Buttons slipped free, fabric pulled to the floor, and skin met skin in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. The first touch of their bare chests sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Nate pressed closer, his breath warm against Ethan's neck as his fingers traced the contours of his back, mapping the scars of a man who had spent his life cleaning up other people's messes but had never truly let anyone in. Stay, Nate murmured against the skin. It wasn't just about the night. It was about everything. Ethan kissed him again, deeper this time, pouring everything he couldn't say into that moment. And for the first time in his life, he let himself believe in something beyond damage control. Aftermath. Ethan never stayed. That was a rule. But as the first traces of morning light spilled to the hotel suite's floor-to-ceiling windows, he was still there, lying on his back, staring at the ceiling while Nathaniel slept beside him. This was a mistake. A career-ending, reputation-ruining, potentially life-destroying mistake. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He needed to leave before Nathaniel woke up, needed to reestablish the lines they had blurred beyond recognition last night. But before he could move, a sleepy voice mumbled, "If you're about to sneak out, don't." Ethan stilled. He turned his head to find Nathaniel watching him, half-lidded eyes filled with something too raw, too unguarded. "This can't happen again," Ethan said, voice low, firm. Nathaniel stretched lazily, but there was a sharpness behind his smile. "That's cute. You think you still have control over this." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I do have control over this." Nathaniel hummed, unconvinced. "Sure, that's why you're still here." Ethan sat up, gripping the edge of the bed. He needed to regain control of the situation, of himself. Nathaniel propped himself up on one elbow. "You're going to tell me this was a one-time thing, that it was a mistake." He studied Ethan, expression unreadable. "But we both know that's a lie." Ethan turned his head, meeting Nathaniel's gaze. "You don't know anything about me." Nathaniel smirked. "I know enough." Ethan exhaled sharply. "This doesn't change anything." Nathaniel tilted his head. "Doesn't it?" "It shouldn't." But the problem was it already had. And Ethan wasn't sure if he could walk away, even if he wanted to. Cracks in the facade. Ethan had spent his career keeping people like Nathaniel out of trouble. Now he was standing too close, in too deep, watching the slow-motion unraveling of a man who had been handed everything and still managed to lose control of it all. He should have walked away that morning. Instead, he was here, back in Nathaniel's penthouse, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching as Nathaniel paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows, a storm brewing behind his blue eyes. "My father knows something's off," Nathaniel muttered, running a hand through his hair. "He hasn't said it outright, but I can tell." Ethan swirled his drink. "Because you've been acting like a man on the verge of a breakdown?" Nathaniel shot him a sharp look. "Appreciate the vote of confidence." Ethan sighed, setting his glass down. "You wanted me to be honest." Nathaniel exhaled, shaking his head. He was unraveling faster than Ethan had anticipated. He had seen it before, men who couldn't live with the weight of their own secrets. And this was a heavy one. "You don't get it," Nathaniel said, voice quieter now. "I wake up every day knowing that I destroyed someone's life. And no amount of PR spin or legal maneuvering can change that." Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You don't get to fall apart." "Not yet," Nathaniel scoffed. "Is that what you tell all the men you clean up after?" "No," Ethan admitted. "You're different." That made Nathaniel pause. His gaze flickered to Ethan, something unreadable behind his eyes. "Why?" Ethan didn't answer. Because he didn't know. Because he had spent his life keeping emotions out of the job, and now, sitting here in the dim glow of Nathaniel's penthouse, that line had already been crossed. And there was no going back. Time and consequences. Nate was sentenced to 4 years in prison for DUI and reckless endangerment. It was a sentence that Ethan never thought would come to pass, one that he had done everything in his power to prevent. But this time he failed. For the first time in his life, he couldn't manipulate the outcome, couldn't call in favors or grease the right palms to make things go away. The law had caught up with them both, and there was no escaping it. Despite the shame and the hollow feeling of defeat that gnawed at him, Ethan didn't regret it. There was a certain sense of clarity now that the chaos of the past had settled. For all his manipulation and control, there was an undeniable truth in the silence that followed the judgment. This was what needed to happen. Nate had made mistakes, yes, but those mistakes weren't just his own. They were their shared burden. Ethan had allowed him to spiral, to carry on like everything would always be fine, when in reality, it never had been. Maybe in some twisted way, this prison sentence was a lesson for both of them. Their love, however, had not wavered. The letters began to arrive within a week of the trial. Simple, handwritten notes that were far more intimate than anything they'd shared before. The word between them, once polished and guarded, became raw and unfiltered. Ethan found himself writing more than he ever had, pouring his thoughts and emotions into every letter. Sometimes, when he missed him too much, he'd write 2 or 3 letters in one night, desperate to bridge the distance, to keep a piece of their connection alive. Nate's letters were like lifelines. They were filled with humor, with vulnerability, with the kind of words that made Ethan realize just how much they'd both been hiding behind the walls they'd built. Nate spoke of the weight of the prison walls around him, of the strange loneliness that existed even in the midst of hundreds of men. But he also spoke of the quiet moments, sitting in the yard, watching the sunset, wondering if Ethan could see it too. The phone calls were rare but precious. When the day came for their first call, Ethan felt his heart hammer in his chest as the phone rang. He had been prepared to hear the cold, indifferent voice of the warden or some faceless operator, but it wasn't. It was Nate's voice, roughened by time, but still undeniably his. "Hey," Nate said, his voice full of a quiet kind of warmth. "I miss you." Ethan didn't trust his own voice at first. The relief of hearing him after so long was overwhelming. The ache of separation too much to bear. "I miss you, too," he managed to say, his words carrying a weight they had never held before. They spoke for just 20 minutes, a short span of time, but to Ethan, it felt like a lifetime. Every word that passed between them felt like a gift. Each one reminding him that despite the circumstances, their bond had only grown. The distance, the separation, the time apart, it didn't diminish what they shared. If anything, it magnified it, making each conversation, each moment, feel more intense, more significant. When Ethan visited, the reality of their situation hit him harder than he expected. The prison was as bleak as he had imagined, but seeing Nate there, behind bars, was a different kind of shock. Nate had always been strong, confident, unshakable in many ways. But now, with the weight of his actions hanging over him, there was a softness in his eyes that Ethan had never seen before. It was raw, almost fragile, like he was letting himself feel the full depth of the consequences. They had to speak through a glass, their words muffled by the barrier between them. But even that didn't dampen the intensity of their connection. They found ways to speak without words, through glances, through gestures, through the shared understanding that this was only a chapter in their story, not the end. As the visits continued, so did their love. It grew stronger, not in the reckless way it had before, but in a quieter, more resolute manner. They knew now that nothing, not even the prison walls, could truly separate them. For once, it was Ethan who needed Nate more than he had ever needed anyone before. The silence between the visits felt unbearable, but it was a silence they had to endure. It was a reminder of the consequences they both had to face. Yet in the midst of that silence, they both found something that neither of them had anticipated. A deeper connection than they'd ever known. A second chance. 4 years had passed since the courtroom doors closed behind Nathaniel Langston. 4 years of concrete walls, regimented schedules, and a loneliness so thick it had become a second skin. But today, the prison gates opened, and the world beyond was waiting. More importantly, Ethan was waiting. Nate's hands trembled slightly as he stepped forward, clutching the small duffel bag that held the only belongings he had left. He expected to see cameras, journalists eager to capture the billionaire's son walking free. But there was nothing. No reporters. No flashing lights. Just Ethan, leaning against a sleek black car, his arms crossed, a small but knowing smile tugging at his lips. The moment Nate saw him, his breath hitched. After all this time, Ethan was still there. Nate swallowed hard, gripping the strap of his bag. "You came." Ethan pushed off the car and took a few slow steps toward him. "Did you really think I wouldn't?" Nate had imagined this moment 1,000 times in his head. Wonder if Ethan would still look at him the same way, if time and distance had eroded what they once were. But standing here, seeing the warmth in Ethan's eyes, he knew the answer. "I wasn't sure I deserved it," Nate admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. Ethan's expression softened. "You did your time. You took responsibility. That's more than most people would do." Nate exhaled a shaky breath. He wanted to believe that, but doubt clung to him like a shadow. Still, Ethan was here, and for now, that was enough. They stood there for a beat, the weight of the past pressing between them. Then Ethan reached out, wrapping his fingers gently around Nate's wrist. It was a simple touch, but it sent something electric through Nate's spine, a reminder that he was no longer alone. "Come on," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Let's go home." Nate nodded, allowing himself to be led to the car. He wasn't sure what the future held, but as long as Ethan was in it, he knew he had a chance to start over. As they drove away, the prison disappearing in the rearview mirror, Nate turned to Ethan. "What now?" Ethan glanced at him, a smirk playing at his lips. Now we figure it out. Together." And for the first time in years, Nate let himself believe in something more than just survival. He let himself believe in hope.